Welcome to the Overthinker's Guide to Modern Marketing, or as we like to call it,
How to sell a sandwich without accidentally starting a cult.
There is, at this very moment, an extraordinary amount of content being created. Somewhere, someone is writing a post about productivity, someone else is filming a video about mindset, and at least 3 people are currently typing,
I wasn't going to share this, but...
which suggests that collectively we are all going to share quite a lot. Hello, I am Sean Makin, and this is the Overthinker's Guide to Modern Marketing, the podcast where we explore marketing, branding, behaviour, and the curious things humans do when they attempt to turn ideas into something other people actually care about. Now, before we begin, a quick reminder from previous episodes. You should ideally be holding a cup of something slightly too expensive and smells like it has a name you're not entirely confident saying out loud. Because nothing quite prepares the mind for marketing strategy like a beverage you're not entirely sure how to pronounce. Today we're talking about content, more specifically why everyone is creating it, why so much of it feels strangely forgettable, and what actually makes content resonate, not just exist. And of course, inevitably we'll return to that important question, why no one has ever been emotionally moved by a slide deck, particularly one with several arrows and very confident conclusion somewhere around slide 14. So settle in and let's spend the next wee while overthinking content together.
Episode 9, Content is Still King, or
Why everyone is creating content, yet so little of it feels like anything.
There is a phrase in marketing that refuses to go away. It appears in blogs, in presentations, in strategy documents, and almost certainly somewhere around slide 14. Content is king. It has been declared many times and usually with great confidence, often accompanied by several arrows pointing in very encouraging directions, and yet, despite all this, it remains stubbornly true. The problem is not that content isn't important. The problem is that everybody's heard this phrase and took it very seriously, perhaps too seriously. Because now, rather than a carefully considered stream of useful information, we have something closer to a content avalanche. An endless, enthusiastic cascade of blog posts, videos, podcasts, social media updates, and the occasional insight that may or may not have been necessary. We are living in what might reasonably be described as the Great Content Flood. A time when everybody is publishing, everything is being shared, and absolutely nothing is being left unsaid. At any given moment, someone is explaining marketing.
Again, I'm sorry.
Someone else is explaining how to explain marketing, and somewhere, inevitably, someone is writing,
Here are 5 things I wish I knew earlier.
which is helpful because it suggests that we can now learn everything important without actually experiencing any of it. Now, this is particularly noticeable on LinkedIn, a platform that has evolved into a sort of digital amphitheatre, where professionals gather to share insights, reflections, and occasionally their entire life philosophy. You will see posts that begin with,
I wasn't going to share this, but...
which is by now widely understood to mean,
I have structured this very carefully, and I am absolutely going to share it.
which can be impressive and sometimes effective, but after a while it's slightly familiar. Now, not so long ago, content was relatively scarce. If a company produced a blog, it was noteworthy. If they created a video, it was impressive. If they published regularly, it was exceptional. Today, of course, publishing regularly is the bare minimum because content is no longer scarce. Attention is. And this leads us to a slightly uncomfortable realization. Your content is no longer competing with your competitors. It's competing with every other brand, every other creator, every other idea, and also social media, breaking news, streaming platform, and a surprisingly compelling video of someone restoring an old chair, which, to be fair, is excellent content. There is a natural instinct in marketing to respond to this by creating more content. more posts, more updates, more ideas, more value, which feels productive, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem, because the issue is not quantity, it's connection. So let's consider this: content that exists versus content that matters. There is a vast difference between content that already exists and content that actually matters. Content that exists fills space. Content that matters fills attention. And attention in modern marketing is a remarkably scarce resource. Now, algorithms are often blamed for this situation. They determine what is seen, what is shared, what is prioritised, and what quietly disappears. Algorithms, in their own slightly mechanical way, are simply responding to human behaviour. They show people what people engage with, which means ultimately the question is not, what does the algorithm want? It's, what do people actually care about? And this is the moment where many marketing strategies become, well, slightly complicated. Because instead of answering that question directly, someone inevitably produces a framework, usually with arrows, all pointing towards something described as engagement. And somewhere within that presentation, yes, it's usually around slide 14, there is a sentence attempting to summarise everything. It sounds impressive, it looks convincing, and it doesn't quite solve the problem, because the real question is not how much content we can create, it's why would anybody choose to pay attention to it? And that question is far more difficult, because it requires understanding people. Not platforms, not formats, not trends, people. Because content may still be king, but in a world where everyone is trying to be heard, the real power lies in not speaking louder, but in saying something worth listening to.
Part 2. Understanding today's audience.
Now, having established that content is everywhere, often in impressive quantities, we arrive at the next logical question.
Who exactly is all of this for?
Because modern audiences are not what they once were. They are more informed, more connected, and slightly more distracted. There was a time when people would sit down and give something their full attention. A book, an article, or even on occasion, a meeting. Now, attention behaves slightly differently. It arrives briefly, evaluates the situation, and if not immediately entertained or informed, leaves. Usually within seconds, sometimes mid-sentence, occasionally when you're still explaining the first bullet point. This is what we now refer to as micro moments. Small, fleeting windows of attention where someone wants to learn, solve, or buy something and they would like to do it immediately, preferably before their coffee gets cold, which, given the price of coffee these days, feels like a very reasonable expectation. Because, as we've already established, you're likely holding a cup of something that smells like it has a name you're not entirely sure how to pronounce. And even that has a lifespan. A brief window in which it is hot, enjoyable, worth the investment, after which it becomes slightly disappointing. Content, rather inconveniently, works much the same way.
The 3-second reality. A relentless, high-speed landscape where attention is fleeting, decisions are instant, and anything that fails to impress within moments is quietly swept away into the endless scroll.
In practical terms, this means your content has approximately 3 seconds, possibly less, to answer a very important question in the mind of your audience.
Is this worth my attention?
If the answer is unclear, they scroll. If the answer is delayed, they scroll. If the answer requires a diagram, they definitely scroll. The modern audience is not uninterested. They are overwhelmed. They are navigating multiple platforms, multiple messages, multiple demands on their attention, often at the same time. Oi, look over here. Isn't that cool? Which means they're not asking, is this content good? They're asking, is this worth stopping for? And that brings us to the myth of the captive audience. There is a lingering assumption in marketing that if content is well crafted, people will naturally engage with it. This assumption is optimistic, because there is no captive audience anymore. No one is waiting patiently for your next update, refreshing their screen in anticipation, hoping that today, finally, you will post something truly remarkable. In reality, your content appears in a feed between a news story, a personal update, an advertisement, and something involving a dog wearing sunglasses. and it must somehow justify its existence within that environment, which is a very challenging brief. So what actually makes someone stop? Relevance, clarity, immediacy. Content that quickly signals, this is for you, this matters, this will help, without requiring a lengthy introduction or indeed a presentation. Because if your key message only becomes clear around slide 14, the audience has by that point moved on, possibly to the dog with sunglasses. The most effective content today does something very quickly. It makes sense. It doesn't require interpretation. It simply communicates clearly, immediately, humanly. There is a tendency in marketing to respond to this challenge by adding more detail, more structure, more explanation, which does feel helpful, but often has the opposite effect because complexity slows understanding, and slowed understanding loses attention. The real shift is not technological, it's behavioural. People have not become less intelligent, although sometimes it does seem that way. They have become instead more selective. They choose where to place their attention, carefully, quickly, and often subconsciously, which brings us to a simple but important thought. In a world of infinite content, attention is earned in moments. Not minutes, not frameworks, not strategies, moments. If your content cannot connect in those moments, it doesn't matter how well it was planned or how beautifully it was presented, it will not connect.
Part 3, storytelling. The only thing that still works.
So, having established that there is too much content, too little attention, and approximately 3 seconds to make an impression, we arrive at a rather important question. What actually works? And the answer, somewhat inconveniently for modern marketing frameworks, is this: story. Now, story is not a new idea. It's existed long before content calendars, social media platforms, and presentations attempting to explain human behaviour. Humans have always told stories, around fires, across tables, in slightly exaggerated conversations about things that definitely happen exactly as described. I swear, Elvis just served me in the chip shop. And despite all technological progress, this hasn't changed. So why does storytelling still work? Stories work because they do something information cannot. They create meaning, provide context, and make ideas feel real. Because facts tell us something, stories help us understand it, and more importantly, remember it. There is a slightly inconvenient truth about memory. People do not easily remember stats, bullet points, or well-structured frameworks. People remember stories because stories feel like experiences, and experiences are harder to ignore. Now, this is where many brands get slightly confused, because not all content is storytelling. Content can inform, content can explain, content can exist. Storytelling does something else. Storytelling connects. It creates a moment, a sense of recognition, a feeling of, I understand this. Or more importantly, I recognise this. Good storytelling works because it taps into something familiar. Not necessarily something dramatic, and not necessarily something extraordinary, just something real. A small insight, a moment of frustration, a lesson learned slightly later than expected. These are the things people recognise, and recognition is the first step towards connection. And here we stumble upon another marketing myth, the big story. There is a common assumption that stories need to be, well, impressive, involving major turning points, significant challenges, possibly a mountain or two, but most effective stories are much smaller, quieter, more ordinary, which is precisely why they work. Because people don't relate to perfection, they relate to reality. Well, we hope. There is often another temptation where people want to structure storytelling too carefully, to refine and optimize it, shape it until it fits neatly into a framework, which is useful for clarity but risky for authenticity, because the more a story is engineered, the less it feels lived. Good stories are not complicated. They simply start, develop, and mean something, which in marketing terms is refreshingly straightforward. The real power of storytelling is this: it slows people down, even in a fast-moving 3-second reality, even in a crowded feed, even between a news update, a social post, and that dog still wearing sunglasses. A good story makes someone pause, and that pause is everything. Because in the end, content may capture attention briefly, but story holds it. Not because it's louder, or more frequent, or better optimized, but because it feels something. And in a world full of content that exists, feeling something is what makes it matter.
Part 4. New formats, same human brain.
Having established that storytelling still works, reassuringly unchanged despite everything, we arrive at something that has changed quite dramatically. Formats. There are now more ways to communicate than at any point in human history. Blogs, videos, podcasts, webinars, live streams, short-form clips, long-form discussions, and occasionally someone speaking directly to camera with the confidence of a person who has absolutely decided that this is their moment.
Get ready with me while I transform into the main character you already are.
Now, each of these formats is often described as new, engaging, game-changing, which is technically true, but also slightly misleading, because while the formats changed, the human receiving them does not. Despite all technological progress, humans still process information in much the same way. We are drawn to clarity, emotion, meaning. We are still curious, skeptical, and occasionally distracted by something completely unrelated.
Oh, what's that dog wearing?
Which means that while the delivery mechanism evolves, the expectation remains the same.
Is this interesting?
Now, of course, not every format works for every message. Some ideas are best written, some are best spoken,
Just like this cool podcast.
and some probably shouldn't have been turned into content at all. Which reminds me of David.
Hello again.
You may remember Dave from episode 8, a perfectly reasonable human being who briefly attempted to become a personal brand.
I prefer David, if you don't mind.
David, decided that video was the future,
Yes, I did.
which, to be fair, it often is. So he invested in lighting,
How much? It's just a fancy light bulb after all.
a camera,
Crumbs. Pricey.
a microphone,
Well, I suppose I've spent lots already. I may as well spend some more. The children don't need to go to uni.
and what he described as a content strategy, which, upon closer inspection, was mostly a spreadsheet with a growing sense of pressure. David's first video began confidently. He looked directly into the camera and said,
Today I want to speak about value.
then paused. Not dramatically, not intentionally, just paused. Because as it turned out, David had not yet decided what value was. He recovered by introducing a framework, 3 key points, and inevitably a diagram with arrows. The video was clear, structured, well lit,
So bright.
and, by all technical standards, very good. It lacked something, a reason to exist.
Oh,
David later described the experience as,
it was strangely exhausting for something that only lasted 2 minutes.
which, in many ways, is the essence of over-engineered content. We are now seeing the rise of short-form everything. There is a growing preference for short-form content, such as short videos, short posts, short explanations, which reflects the reality we discussed earlier. Attention is brief. But this creates an interesting tension, because while attention is short, understanding still takes time. People want information quickly, but they also want it to be meaningful, which is slightly like asking for, a deep conversation in under 8 seconds. It can be done, but it requires precision, which brings us back to our 3-second reality. A fast-moving environment where content appears, is judged instantly, and either earns attention or disappears entirely. And formats are slightly different ways of entering that moment. Now, podcasts are an interesting exception because they ask for something unusual. Time. A willingness to listen, to stay, to engage with an idea beyond the initial 3 seconds, which suggests something quite hopeful, that despite everything, people are still willing to slow down, occasionally, provided, of course, that content is worth it. So what does format actually do? It doesn't create interest, it carries it. It doesn't generate meaning, it delivers it. And if the underlying idea isn't strong, no format can fix that. This is why a beautifully designed presentation with elegant slides, clean typography, and several arrows pointing confidently into the future can still fail to connect. Because format does not replace substance, it simply presents it. There is a natural impulse in marketing to chase new formats, to be early, to adopt the latest platform, to experiment with whatever is currently described as
the future of content.
which is understandable but slightly risky because trends change, formats evolve, platforms rise and fall, but the fundamentals remain remarkably stable. No matter the format, effective content still needs a queer idea, a human voice, a reason to exist. Without these, content becomes, well, technically correct, visually appealing, but entirely forgettable. If your message is strong, it works anywhere. As a blog, as a video, as a podcast, even in extreme cases, as a conversation. Remember those? Because if your message only works across one channel that requires context and explanation, it may not be the format that's the problem. Formats will continue to evolve, platforms will change, new tools will appear, and old ones will disappear. But the human on the other side will be asking the same question. Is this worth my attention? And no format, however innovative, can answer that on its own.
Part 5. Artificial Intelligence, Search and the Rise of Useful Content.
Having explored content, audiences, storytelling, and the many ways we attempt to present ideas, we arrive at something quietly reshaping the entire landscape. Artificial intelligence, search, and the growing expectation that content, quite simply, should be useful. There was a time in marketing when success meant being visible, appearing in search results, ranking highly, being seen, and for a while this worked, because visibility was relatively scarce. But now, visibility is everywhere, which means being seen is no longer enough. You also have to be worth seeing. Search engines have now started to understand what people actually mean. Not just the words, but the intent behind them. The context, the question, which is impressive and slightly unnerving because it means content is no longer rewarded for sounding correct, but for being helpful. There was, at one point, a perfectly valid approach to content that involved choosing a keyword and repeating it often enough that the algorithm would eventually agree with you. This approach is evolving because modern systems are less impressed by repetition and more interested in relevance. So there's a slightly ironic twist here. We've reached a point where the best performing content is the content that behaves like it wasn't created purely to perform, which is, from a marketing perspective, slightly awkward, because it suggests that the most effective strategy is to stop sounding like you have one. This is particularly noticeable in content that feels over-engineered, posts that sound like they were carefully constructed, thoroughly optimized, and gently encouraged to perform, often beginning with,
This changed everything for me.
which by now has changed quite a lot of things for quite a lot of people. So what does useful actually mean? Now, usefulness is a deceptively simple concept. Useful content simply answers a question, solves a problem, clarifies something confusing, or helps someone move forward. That's it. The difficulty, of course, is that simplicity feels insufficient. We instead think it must be more complicated than that.
Surely there must be a multi-stage process involving diagrams and arrows.
But often, the most useful content is the simplest, because simplicity reduces effort and reduced effort increases understanding. Now, AI plays an interesting role here. It is excellent at organising information, structuring ideas, producing content quickly. But usefulness does not come from speed. It comes from understanding. And understanding, rather nicely, still requires a human. AI works best when it supports thinking, and it cannot decide what matters. That part still belongs to you. One of the risks with AI-generated content is that it can be flawlessly constructed, accurate in detail, well-organised in form, yet leave no lasting impression. Because correctness is not the same as usefulness, and usefulness is what people are actually looking for. Audiences are no longer impressed by volume, frequency, or sheer output. They are looking for clarity, relevance, and something that genuinely helps. Which means the standard has quietly changed from how much can you produce to how much does this matter. The real advantage now is not speed, it's insight, not output, but understanding. Because while everybody can generate content, not everyone can create something that genuinely helps. Which is why so much of it feels impressively useless.
Growth happens when you step into the version of yourself that's already capable of growing.
Which brings us to a tad uneasy but useful truth. If your content is not helping someone, it's probably being ignored. Not out of malice, not out of rejection, simply because there's something else out there which is more useful.
Welcome to the Reasonably Accurate Guide to Marketing and Mild Panic podcast.
Because in the end, content is no longer judged by how often it appears or how well it performs, but by what it does. Does it help? Does it clarify? Does it make something easier? And if the answer is yes, then it works.
Part 6. Creating content that resonates.
So what does good content actually look like? It resonates, it connects, it provides value. Good content tends to do 3 things. 1. It understands the audience. 2. It tells a story. 3. It solves a problem. That's it. No mystery, no 12-step framework, no need for arrows.
Part 7. The real challenge.
So after everything we've explored, content, audiences, storytelling, formats, algorithms, usefulness, and David's brief but memorable relationship with video, we arrive at what might be the most important part of all. The real challenge. Because the challenge was never simply, how do we create content? That part we've established has been thoroughly solved. We can create content endlessly, efficiently, sometimes accidentally. The real challenge is something far more difficult. How do we create something worth paying attention to? Not something that fills space or meets a quota, not something that looks impressive on a content calendar, but something that makes a person stop. Even briefly, in a world that is very good at not stopping. There is, of course, a perfectly logical response to this challenge. Produce more, post more often, increase visibility, remain relentlessly, almost suspiciously consistent. Which all sounds extremely sensible, in the same way that adding more clocks might seem like a solution to running out of time. This approach is usually supported by a schedule, a system, and if we're being entirely honest, several spreadsheets quietly multiplying in the background like highly organised rabbits, each one colour-coded, each one optimistic, each one convinced that this finally is the week that everything becomes consistent. And so, content is produced, regularly, reliably, heroically, until eventually it begins to feel less like communication and more like a form of admin exercise with a personality. Because there is, unfortunately, a difference between being present and making an impact. Presence is easy. You can be present every day, every hour, every potentially 9 minutes if the schedule becomes particularly ambitious. Impact, however, is rare. Impact requires something slightly more complicated, meaning. And meaning, rather inconveniently, cannot be scheduled in advance on a Tuesday morning at 9:14. Presence is about frequency. Impact is about resonance. Presence fills space, impact fills minds. And while showing up is important, simply showing up repeatedly does not guarantee that anyone will remember you were actually there. Let's take a few minutes to talk about the risk of blending in. In a crowded content landscape, something happens. Content that is well structured, professionally written, perfectly aligned with expectation begins to blend in. Not because it's bad, but because it's familiar. And familiarity without distinction becomes invisible. Which is why you can scroll through an entire LinkedIn feed of insightful posts, thoughtful reflections, carefully constructed lessons, all beginning with,
I wasn't going to share this, but...
and remember, none of them. The real challenge then is not to be louder or faster or more frequent. It's to be clearer. to say something that makes sense immediately without requiring interpretation. Now, saying something simple can feel risky because it doesn't sound particularly impressive. It just feels like clarity, and clarity is what people actually need. Especially as clarity doesn't really require several arrows pointed towards success, because if it did, David would still be explaining his video.
I sadly would.
Interestingly, one of the most important skills in modern content creation is restraint. Knowing what not to say, what not to include, and what not to over-explain, because every additional layer of complexity reduces the likelihood of understanding. The advantage then belongs to those who can communicate something real without turning it into a performance. And here's the reassuring part. You don't need to outproduce everyone, outpost everyone, or out-optimize everyone. You simply need to be understood, which is a much smaller and more human goal. Because in the end, the real challenge is not creating content, it's creating something that matters, something that connects, something that stays with someone slightly longer than 3 seconds. And in a world full of content that exists, that is a surprisingly rare achievement.
Part 8. Content is king, but only if it means something.
So yes, content is still king. But only when it does something, when it connects, when it resonates, when it makes someone stop scrolling, even briefly, and think, that was actually worth my time. Because in the end, people don't remember the format, the platform, the strategy, and they don't remember the diagram, the arrows, or even, believe it or not, our beloved slide 14. They remember stories, the ones that felt real, the ones that made sense, even if they occasionally began with,
I wasn't going to share this, but...
Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Overthinker's Guide to Modern Marketing. Until next time, stay curious and remember, content may be king, but meaning is what gives it a kingdom. And if your content does require a slide deck, please keep it under 14 slides. No one trusts slide 14. Cheers!
The Overthinker's Guide to Modern Marketing is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, and many other places where humans briefly stop scrolling, long enough to listen to something slightly more thoughtful.